because I have a handful of small producers who've had their wines copied in China. So yeah, how is technology able to try and bridge that gap ultimately?
Welcome back to the Wine Tech Insiders Podcast, episode 27, Wine Crime. There's crime happening in the wine world as we speak all over, and we're going to dive into that and figure out if technology can help, what technology can do. Back with us is a full slate of our wine insiders. We have Lori from Outshinery.
Hi, everyone. Super happy to be here.
Nick from Wine Owners.
Hi there.
Seb from Trolley.
Good morning, boys and girls.
And Jonathan from Bottle Books.
Good evening. Nice to be back.
So there's been some recent news. I mean, there's constantly news on this. Some of the most interesting stuff from the high end to the low end. The low end, there were 12 bottles of fake Yellowtail that cost a Birmingham store to lose their license. There were 8,000 bottles of counterfeit Penfolds worth over 1.6 million caught in China, which is also very interesting, that China might be cracking down on this. And we'll also share an article about Berry Brothers and Rudd looking into this, taking this seriously. What stood out to you, Lori, about all of these stories? Which one really caught your attention?
I think like at first, like the Penfolds, just because like the amount of, $1.6 million, like we're getting, like quite high. It's just like, oh, like what a heist. But then the Yellowtail was also fascinating because this is really like the opposite end of the spectrum. And I love the story how like a wine drinker recognized that he wasn't as good, put it as good between quotation marks, as a regular Yellowtail, and that's how they got busted. So that was just like, that was kind of like interesting. And more like reading, preparing for this podcast and reading all about this in the news, it's just like, with the trend right now of all the TV series about like scammers and grifters, I'm like, when are we going to get the TV show about wine? Like, it's just like, you've got the decor, you've got like the drama, like, it's just like Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Hulu, or whatever. I have a feeling it's coming.
You do have 67 Pall Mall TV, which is wine TV, 24-hour a day wine TV.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah. It's on a streaming platform, and it's not 24 hours. It's 8 hours worth of programming multiplied by 3 to cover off different time zones. But yeah, it's chock-a-block full of content, and I'm sure Maureen's probably been on at least once, talking of the wine detective.
Right, like it's just like more like like just like how did they go so far? Like like just like from heist in a cellar where people are just like sitting wine, drilling hole underneath, or just counterfeiting Penfolds and just or other brand. Like it's really fascinating. It would make, I think, for a good TV drama.
So you're looking for a true crime series more than winemakers once a wife, right?
Yeah, like it's just because I think there's so much, like romanticization of the world of wine, like sometimes to its detriment. So I just think it gives a good decor and setting. You've got crime, luxury, decor, terroir, and also international. Like like what's interesting, like the wines like Penfolds is technically Australian, sold in the Chinese market. It's just like we have other stories where it's French wine sold in the US market, and it's just just prone for TV.
So action plan, I'm gonna get a script writer. Laurie, you find a movie producer. Nick, you find a budget, find the money to make it done. And Jonathan, you can find the actors, and we're good to go.
There we go.
Has anyone ever opened a bottle of wine and realized it was fake, or has anyone ever had this experience? Or
and look, from my point of view, I've had corked wine a number of times, and sometimes you kind of think, would I know? Would I not know? once you've tried cork wine, you know. Fake wine, the question is, and that's interesting, that the Yellowtail story, because if we go back to the Rudy sour grape stories a couple of years ago, how much does the consumer would know? How much does the consumer actually care? If we're talking about average everyday consumer, look, it's hurting the brand. It's hurting high-end consumers, right? Collectors. But the mass wine market in the middle, I don't know that I would actually pick that a wine is fake.
Like I would say also potentially, like also there's no control whatsoever of what's going on in this bottle. I mean, you hear in like third world country, like people dying from like alcohol poisoning because there is no control. Like that's also like, okay, so it may not be the real thing, and that's a problem. But then really what's in there, right? Like that's also like wine is always a bit of a question mark, strangely so, right? As we already know as an industry, but like if it's counterfeit question mark, like it's just like, okay, so really what's in there? Like that's also like as a consumer, and I'd be like I would be worried, right?
Yeah, it's not straightforward.
But I think like the thing about the Yellowtail is that, you know, I hadn't really thought about it before. I mean, all the stories that you hear about are about the high end wines, but you don't hear a lot of the stories about the medium or low end wines as much. But the fact that this was being apparently pushed by the mafia, then I was like, okay, well, this kind of all makes sort of sense. It's kind of their MO. They take something that is affordable, mass market, can fly under the radar, and they just take a little bit of a cut off of it. And so I could see quite a racket there, and that's going on. The mafia is behind it. You can see how people can come up with numbers that say that 25% of the wine in distribution is not what you think it is, but you do need somebody that's more organized. I mean, Rudy was pretty big time, but not in the volume, nowhere close to the volumes of 25%. So you actually would need an organization behind it to make it work. But then you connect this back to one of our previous episodes, you know, with this with being able to print your own drinks. You know, we're talking people detect. This one was found out because it tasted different. But if you could print the same thing, hack it so you didn't have to pay royalties, and then you're basically printing an exact copy of Yellowtail. How are you going to be able to figure out which wine is counterfeit and which isn't in the future?
Nick,
does it matter?
Yeah.
Nick, you're providing software for a lot of high-end sellers, and do you think if you own, what do you think from their perspective? Do you even want to know which bottles? It could be 10% of your bottles or something. That would be an incredible loss of money. Is it all just a kind of, people just want to keep it as hushed up as possible, or do people actually want to know?
Oh, yes, very good question. I think drinkers definitely want to know. And I've been to one or two sessions of Maureen Downey in the UK where she's showed bottles that have been proven to be fakes, and also kind of reviewed bottles to determine whether or not they might be fakes. But that's quite kind of all low tech, really, in the sense that, that at that level of evaluation, it's all about, the type of bottle used and the label, and comparing the labels to other labels, and looking at the print on labels and figuring out whether it's been printed or whether it's been laser printed, and all of that. And, does the cork correspond, does the vintage on the cork correspond to the vintage that's on the bottle? Is the capsule the same capsule? Does the capsule look like it's been wrinkled, or is it tight as you would expect on a bottle where the capsule's been applied on a bottling line? So that's all sort of pretty low tech, and I think it's complicated as well by the reality, particularly in in areas where production is relatively high, because a producer won't just source from one bottle supplier. If they're bottling 10,000 12 packs of the same wine, they'll go to a number of different sources. They will have issues of printing. Some labels will come out faded than other labels towards the end of a print run. So the premise that there is a single defined version of something that you then compare everything else to determine whether it's a fake or not is somewhat flawed. And so, so what do you do about that if you're a collector? How do you sort of determine whether you've got fake wines in your cellar or not? And I think there are a number of very practical answers to that question, such as, are you buying at first release? Who are you buying from? What the age of the wine is? And does it come with its original packaging? Satisfying yourself that the chain of supply for the wine that you're buying from the source that you're buying from kind of makes sense. So being sort of practical about it, if you like. So and if at the extreme end of the spectrum, the stuff that we were talking about in respect of the ancient wines being reproduced, being effectively reprinted by Rudy Kanalian, or the sorts of wines that Hardy Rodenstock was buying. You have to, as a collector at that end of the market, be very clear in your own mind about the evidence that you have around traceability. And I think the trouble is, at that end of the market, there's such a desire to own these extremely rare and scarce things, and perhaps an assumption that the auction houses are always going to have successfully filtered out the fakes from the non-fakes, which is clearly not the case, and clearly and what happens when something is identified as a fake? Does it get destroyed, or does it get given back to the consignor, and therefore effectively gets put back into it gets put back into distribution again? So going forward, clearly there are lots of things that people have been trying to do in terms of applying technology or different technologies to bottles. The problem is that there isn't a single technology that's been applied and adopted globally, whether it's bubbles on capsules, or infrared technology embedded within the paper labels, or whether it's etching on the glass, whatever it may be, and maybe that those technologies combined with things like NFTs might be part of the future, but they'll only be part of the future if you can store those wines in warehouses where the warehouse owner is actually prepared to take some steps that technology requires them to take in order to provide a chain of custody that people would look for. So I think today the reality is practical solutions in terms of due diligence and trace and satisfying yourself about chain of supply.
I would add on to that and challenge some ideas that you're putting out here. First and foremost, we're talking about technologies of the future, and I disagree. We have had Bluetooth enabled, we have had seals of authenticity, we have had near field communication, we've had blockchain based wines. We're now talking close to a decade? And yet it is clearly not adopted by the industry today, right? I think ultimately we do need a technology or a suite of technologies in different markets in order to transparently have as much as we can of a relationship back to the producer. The producer ultimately is the one who should know how much was produced really, where was it distributed really, what features in the taste and what features in the bottle on the bottle were actually put through. So we need that transparency as much as we can, but the industry has not adopted the technology, which has been there for years, right? And the next question is really, how much do we really want to know? As an industry, look, it's been highlighted a number of times. If we're saying now about 25% of the wine could be counterfeit.
I mean, I think that is, to be honest, in itself debatable. I think it's a number that's been put out there. It's been, what was the source of that percentage?
Yeah, correct. Look, make it 10.
Was it put out there by somebody who whose interest it is in for that number to be
correct? But the exact figure is irrelevant here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point is that
the percentage is irrelevant. Is it 2% or 3% or 1% or whatever? 1% is quite a lot, right?
Correct. Exactly right. So the percentage is irrelevant. The question is, if someone buys something that they feel is counterfeit, are they going to admit that, fuck, they were fooled, they fell for it, right? And if a producer discovers their wine has been counterfeit, a bit of a beat. But how much is the industry? How much are the producers? How much are the consumers really wanting to highlight counterfeit products? Look, it's we're working with producers around the globe.
I don't necessarily buy into that thought. I think producers want to know. I think.
But what are they going to do about it?
Consumers kind of want. But of course, if it's the intellectual property of the owner, the producer, that's been breached, then they need to accept that if they think something is counterfeit, giving it back to the producer via their distributor, that it is in the lap of the producer to make good if they choose to or not. In other words, they're not going to get that bottle back again, and probably rightly so.
Look, it's interesting. I worked with, look, I have a number of stories from the last few years on counterfeit products. One of them, a winery we work with in South Australia, who shipped a half a container to China, and it got stuck in, at border control. And after 3 weeks being stuck and being in limbo, the winemaker, the winery owner, we're talking like a 10,000 cases produced winery. It's not a big winery. The winemaker flew to China and discovered that his half container was actually turned into 3 half containers. All right. And look, I know him really well. I'm not going to name names. You know who you are if you're listening. I asked him, okay, what widget can we put on the bottle? What are we going to do about that so that it stops? And he kind of went, I'm just going to stop exporting to China. Right. And so ultimately, how much is the industry really having an appetite for regulating this? There's NFTs, there's different things. I'm not convinced that unless we have someone like LCBO, SAQ, unless we have someone like possibly like Constellation, like one of those large enterprises going, we're implementing this, I don't know that the consumers would start buying a wine because it's officially Bluetooth enabled, verified from the winery. And I don't know that the winemakers have enough of a burden and that problem to actually do something about it.
So I wonder if the new EU regulation will have any impact on this? That's putting QR codes on everything, at least on the detection end, that you're going to have more wines going everywhere in the world that have QR codes, because you're not just going to put a QR code on your wine for Europe, you're just going to put it on for everywhere, right? And so you're going to have more codes going into China. They will, of course, be counterfeited because there's nothing preventing you from counterfeiting a QR code. But you would be able to see where in the world your wines are getting scanned, and you'll be able to tell whether it's a tourist that visited your winery and took a case home with them, or if it was, as a percentage, there's probably the wine got into the country, or this wine came into existence some other way. So I think that could be an interesting thing in the mix. I mean, it's not there's no panacea to this, right? I mean, it's a handcrafted product. All the measures to protect against it are more expensive. They cut too much into the margin for most wineries to contemplate, especially when at the end of the day, it depends on the consumer taking enough interest in counterfeiting to actually use these aids, because that's where the verification ultimately needs to be.
Yeah.
Look, it's clear. I think that whatever solution gets implemented, clearly for the industry, we're working in a fairly traditional style industry, right? Whatever technology, whatever solution cannot be implemented for the benefit of the solution itself. So if you're looking at blockchain, you cannot just have a blockchain of wine tomorrow because blockchain is cool as a technology. It needs to solve another underlying kind of a problem. And I think, look, the QR code is definitely a really good starting point. QR codes are increasingly being recognized worldwide, so that has a few more legs. The challenge is really how much information is that QR code capable of surfacing? How many hands has the product moved through? How many bottles were actually produced? The producer would start seeing with the QR code, where is the wine being scanned? Yeah, fair enough. And start identifying some area of, that's a bit of a question mark over there. And the consumer would have a bit more information about the producer, but there's still a disconnect in the chain, right? Most consumers in North America who buy a European wine, most of them really could scan it, but they don't really know who's handled the product and has it been counterfeit in the middle. It's a fascinating topic. And look, we're talking about wine. I'm assuming there is such a thing as counterfeit beers, probably not as much because there's a lot of sort of volume that can be produced. There is also, there's counterfeit food, right? So we work with producers of food and beverages at large, and we have farmers market police who are identifying organic farmers labeled as organic, but not truly certified as organic, right? Or family-owned farmers, when in reality, it's not really the family, it's just, a girl and a boy just selling produce they bought at the wholesale market. So it exists in different markets. It definitely exists in different markets.
But this sounds maybe also like as you were mentioning, Seb, that there's technological solutions that might be beneficial to larger players, like for instance, organic. I mean, it's great to have organic certifications, but they cost money, and but it's important for consumers, but there's also a kind of system around that, and there's fees, and there's infrastructure, and there's regulation, and all of this stuff, and it makes it more and more difficult for smaller producers to track all of this, there's a lot of producers who are basically organic, but they just can't deal with the certifications, they're not there yet or whatever, and it costs money and this and that, and so there's a lot of interesting technologies, but maybe in the end, we're talking about big players, and even in the China case, it's a massive brand that they crack down on. So are they going to care? Do they care about your small producer, Seb? Probably not, but maybe the massive brand has massive distribution tied to a big company in China that can pull some weight and get some stuff done.
And arguably, Yellowtail, at the cost of production and the cost at which they're selling the wine, Yellowtail probably cannot afford adding a 50-cent widget on each bottle. There's also the economics aspect of it, right? Look, I think as an industry, the effort needs to be coming from both consumer marketing, consumer education, as well as producer education. The more producers are using technology, the more technology can help make their product data, make their brand data transparent. You're talking about organics. Look, organic certifications are fascinating because they change by country, right? So really, what's a biodynamic wine? I mean, who knows? It's currently today, this is strictly marketing. Consumers are demanding biodynamic wines. As a producer, just slap biodynamic on it. Right now, from a technology standpoint, if producers adopt more technologies and leverage technologies, the technology is increasingly capable of helping them achieve organic certification, helping them having the right data at the right spot to make sure that this certification process is much simpler. And likewise, from a consumer perspective, I think ultimately we really need to educate consumers as to, like, the QR code might be a good starting point. But educate consumers to seek, to check, to look at where is this product from. Increasingly, we're seeing people, you go to the grocery stores and some people are looking at the back label. Okay, how much sugar is in this? Okay, how much bloody palm oil is in this? So there's a number of different things consumers are slowly starting to do. We need to give consumers the tools to actually get to that information, because increasingly they will be seeking it. You know what I mean? So it needs to come from different front, because I doubt, unless the SAQ, LCBO, unless a big brand gets behind it, like the education of both the producers and the consumers will take years. You know what I mean?
That was episode 27 of the Wine Tech Insiders podcast, Wine Crime. I'd like to thank all of our insiders, Laurie, Nick, Seb, and Jonathan. We'll see you all in a few weeks.
Thank you, guys. Take it easy. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Bye.
Bye.